still is just this amazing discovery, one thing after another, to learn about all sorts of things that I just didn't know about. So I hope that for the readers I've communicated that kind of excitement that I have, and continue to nurture in my own work as a historian. Does anybody, if anybody has looked at the book, I didn't get the sense that anybody had. I just want to stop at this point. Do you have any questions? Even if you haven't, if you just have any general questions about everything from the photographs to anything I've said, and that includes criticisms. My skin's pretty thick at this point, so that.
How many chapters was the book that you originally planned to write?
It was
before you had to.
It was 12 chapters plus the preface and the conclusion, and I can tell you, I knew that this would come up today. I should probably backtrack a little bit. One of the, I didn't elaborate that much in the preface, but I said I got the idea from other historians. What I was thinking of, there's a school of historiography in France. It's known as the Annales School. And these are historians in France that they've written these magnificent works going back to the 20s. One of them, Marc Bloch, was writing some of this when he was in a German POW camp when he was captured during the war as a member of the French army. I mean, it's just an incredible story, that alone. But they looked at what they called the long view. And I say that in the conclusion. I said that they had them in mind. The history of Genesee County is a long stretch of time that's punctuated by specific events and specific developments. And that's why I warn the reader in the preface that if you're looking for specific dates and you're looking for chronology, you basically picked up the wrong book, because I just didn't think of Genesee County's history in that way. That's why I could start with something like the assassinations in the 1960s, and then 2 chapters later, when I look at immigration in the county and focus on 2 groups in particular, I could jump to the 1840s, because it's not simply that magically things develop because the calendar turns pages. There are all kinds of cultural and political developments that really go beyond that. And that's why I could just roam all over. It's not because I'm disorganized. I know there's a chronology there. But that's not my major concern, quite honestly. Which I knew initially might be a little confusing for some readers until they got used to what I was doing. And that's why I addressed that issue of chronology in the preface. The Annales historians, people like Fernand Braudel, they've written these books in which they're looking at things like, well, how did people think of old age in medieval France, and how did people address witchcraft in medieval France? And they would jump from something like that to a play. The point is not to see history as this purposeful development, but rather to see it as life is itself. It's often unpredictable and chaotic. And that is the reality for most people. And it's certainly not simply a history of what, the bigwigs up there are doing. Much of what's going on is taking place locally in the minds of people looking at those big developments. And that's why I constantly was going back and forth between the national story and the story here in Genesee County. I started with that chapter 1, the assassinations, because I think it's pretty indisputable that the murder of President Kennedy, of his brother Robert, and of course of Martin Luther King, that had long-term consequences nationally, which you can talk about for hours, but it also had long-term consequences here in the county. And so how people perceive this, their reactions as reflected in something like daily news reports, tells us a lot about that connection between the national and the local. it raised a lot of questions in my mind as I was writing that chapter. For example, I have a photograph in chapter 1 near the end in the Martin Luther King section, a photograph of students in a class at the Ross Street School in Batavia in 1894. I'm looking through the albums, I'm looking through the photographs, and I said, oh my God, there are 2 African American students in there. And then I started to see, they had integrated schools here in the county. This is 1894 that we're talking about. This is long before the Voting Rights Acts in the 1950s and the Civil Rights Movement in its modern phase in the mid-1960s. And it helps to explain why when Martin Luther King was assassinated, even though there are civil disturbances taking place, I think it was 184 cities around the country over the ensuing week after his death, Genesee County remained absolutely quiet. And one reason for that is the African American population was pretty low. It was about 3% from the census records, but also because there was not a perception that the police department here was racist against African Americans as a whole. 4 years before, in neighboring Monroe County, they had huge race riots, in part that were started because of a perception in the black community that the police were racist against blacks. So once you, again, started basically peeling this onion, this connection between past and present, national and local, you start to see all these other issues start to arise. In that same chapter, as I know everyone is aware, there are endless conspiracy theories that circulate to this day about who killed JFK. And yet you look at something like Bugliosi's book, he spends, 500 pages, not as an historian, as a prosecutor, talking about the voluminous information that is contained in the Warren Commission report, which clearly points, on one level, to Oswald as the sole assassin, and yet there is this conspiracy thinking that more than one entity was involved in his killing. And that took root early on here in Genesee County. And I briefly allude to that in chapter 1. So once again, you start looking at the connections between local and national, and it raises all these attendant, I think, fascinating issues. Chapter 2, I radically shifted the focus. That was the Cold War chapter. And I thought, well, how can I really grab that? I came across in my research this preparedness drill that took place at the VA hospital that still stands in 1956. And if you look at that chapter, all kinds of things developed in connection to that. Not the least of which was the attempt to normalize, right here in Genesee County, the idea that nothing to worry about. There are all these missiles that the Soviets have and the United States has, but we could survive a nuclear attack. We just have to be prepared medically, have enough supplies, have enough medical personnel on standby, and keep the roads cleared. It completely ignored the most basic literature. This goes back to when I was working for the Air Force. It completely ignores the literature on, well, what would a post-blast world look like? That's assuming we even had medical personnel. That's assuming we had roadways. That's assuming we had anybody alive to address those who might still be alive, now dying from radioactive poisoning and all the rest of it. It was incredible to see the effort in New York State and locally here in the county to convince people in 1956 nothing to get nervous about, nothing to feel anxious about. Even if they send nuclear missiles our way, we'll retaliate and you'll all be protected and we can go on with our life come Monday morning. Nothing could be further from the truth scientifically. One of the people I cited in that chapter was a biologist He wrote a book back in 1983, Jonathan Shell, The Fate of the Earth. He has one chapter that really captures all this. He says, a republic of grass and ants. Basically, nothing's going to be left for purely scientific reasons. And to play loose with the idea of using nuclear weapons is, to say the least, not supported just by the science, by the physical science. So that was some of the thinking I had in that chapter 2. Chapter 3, immigrants to white ethnics. I have to admit, that was in many ways an article I enjoyed basically as a plaything. This was my stab at political correctness in the contemporary academy, because to start with, it's long fallen out of favor that you would use the term white ethnics. If you look at what they now call ethnic studies departments, and it doesn't matter, pick your college, ethnicity is restricted to fewer and fewer groups, as if somehow Polish Americans or Italian Americans or Irish Americans, or for that matter, British Americans, are not ethnic. Everybody has an ethnicity. So I knew that immediately, once this book went out for reviews, I would be critiqued for using that term, which I really look forward to, because I don't really, at this point, need them anymore for a career, so I could write what I want, and I did. Here in Genesee County, I point out on I think it was the second page of that chapter 3, that we had a number of immigrant groups arrive in the county, going back to the beginning of the county, immigrants from England, immigrants from Scotland. But those two groups basically formed what I like to call an American nationality that the rest of the groups were expected in the 19th and much of the 20th century to assimilate to. You really have to shift your thinking, because in our own day, when we talk about diversity and multiculturalism, we assume that it's really indefensible to argue for an American nationality. I remember when I was still teaching, I had students in California tell me there is no such thing as American culture. It's my people. And I would ask them, well, who exactly are your people? You're living in the United States. And then they would have a very puzzled look on their face. I knew eventually that was the sign I should probably retire and leave the classroom, because I was trying to look at ethnicity as historically we had, that it is a cultural construction, basically, that changes over time. And in the county's history, there were two ethnic groups that arrived in the 19th and early 20th century in largest numbers. Those groups, of course, were the Irish, and I talk about that in one section of that chapter, and then the Italians. And neither of those groups were considered, when they first arrived, and this was true nationally, not just in Genesee County, they were not considered white. They were considered to be, well, aliens, foreigners. They were both, to start with, they were both non-British. They were not from Scotland. And most damning, especially in the 19th century, they tended to be, not completely, but they tended to be Roman Catholic. And that meant a whole set of obstacles that would be faced by those immigrants. But the story didn't end there. As I pointed out by the end of the chapter, not everyone would agree with me on this. Eventually those two groups assimilated into the mainstream of county life. And I tried to give examples of how you could find them in various positions of political authority, of basically cultural acceptance. That chapter I thought was important to keep in out of those original 12, because it raised many other issues I looked at in there for the reader that I'm not mentioning here, but I'd be happy to talk about if you wanted to. Then once again, I radically shifted focus. Chapter 4, that was chapter, the chapter on Hoover, Roosevelt, and the New Deal. That was something that's been a long-standing interest of mine. When I first got, I mentioned in the preface, I said I owe much to other people for this book. I mentioned a professor, he's still alive, he's now retired, of course, at Rutgers, Elliot Rosen, who's considered one of the main authorities on Hoover, Roosevelt, and the New Deal. And I had the great fortune when I first started as a history major, fresh out of the Coast Guard, and all this stuff was so new. And my first class with Professor Rosen, I thought, I want his job. This is really interesting to me, the economic history and all that. And so that chapter really was a way for me to go home intellectually and connect that here to Genesee County. Hoover, Roosevelt, what does the New Deal mean here? And it got even more fascinating as I realized, as I did the research, here we are in the depths of the Depression in the county in 1932. We've got national unemployment, 25%. There is basically no hope out there. I mean, people are eating out of garbage cans. I mean, I only included a few of the stories that come up, say, in the Daily News and other sources in 1932 here in the county at the time. There was real despair. There was incredible family disarray. In one case, a mother murdered 2 of her children out of 4 because she was worried about their economic futures and how she could provide for them. A husband who murdered his wife and then killed himself because he couldn't face unemployment. They were both college graduates. That didn't mean anything for many people in 1932. And here you have all of that, and yet Genesee County, completely contrary to most of New York State, not to mention the country at large, with the exception of a few states, they voted for the incumbent Republican Herbert Hoover, as if the Depression wasn't even taking place. So the obvious question is, well, why? How do you explain that? I mean, we all know this is not news to anyone here. This is a deeply culturally Republican county. And it's not that Democrats don't exist here and other political persuasions to a lesser degree, but it is for the most part Republican. And in 1932 in particular, how do you explain that? And I tried to offer at least some explanation that Hoover really, even though he's not from Genesee County, he represented in his life one of the cherished ideals here, that it doesn't matter who you're born to. If you have purpose, if you work hard enough, you could make something of your life, as Herbert Hoover did. I mean, he goes from being an orphan at 10 years old in Iowa to the presidency of the United States, to a multi-millionaire, world-famous engineer. He represented, coming out of a farm family, that's a whole other aspect of his life, he represented, for many in Genesee County, despite the Depression, the promise of America. And there's concern about the Depression, no doubt about it, but the fear was, if we accept this idea of a realignment between the federal government and ourselves, we could be throwing away an America that's worked for most people. This Depression will eventually pass, but if we saddle ourselves with all kinds of programs that may be good right now, but may not look so good 15 years in the future. So that was basically the thinking here in the county. And it didn't change. 4 years later, 1936, the Depression's still on. It's not as bad because of some of the New Deal programs, but unemployment's still high. I elaborate on that in the chapter. And yet, once again, despite the fact that Alf Landon, the Republican candidate in 36, he wins 2 states nationally, despite the fact Roosevelt overwhelmingly has a mandate in 1936, he loses here in Genesee County. And once again, we're back to that question, why? And now Herbert Hoover's out of the picture. Well, by 1936, I stress this in that chapter, the New Deal, even here, starts to be seen in a different light than even 4 years before. The different light is something called fascism. In other countries, remember, it's a global economic collapse. In other countries, even as early as 1922 in Italy, they're rejecting any semblance of parliamentary democracy in favor of a dictatorship. This is, of course, brought to a head in 1933 when Hitler comes to power in Germany. So a paper like the Daily News in its editorial stresses, even for those of us who don't support the New Deal programs, we have some real anxiety about these programs being created. At least here in this country, we have a moderate, humane response to an economic collapse that in other countries is producing this ruthless, tyrannical dictatorship. Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, fascist Japan, which has already invaded China several years before, in 1931. So by that point, the New Deal starts to be seen differently, in part because people already are sensing something's afoot here. We're seeing the war clouds already, even before World War II breaks out in 1939. Then once again, I shift to focus. Chapter 5, something which came up in a lot of conversations over the years here in the history department. People were shocked to hear the Ku Klux Klan in Western New York. That's something they do down in Alabama. I didn't know they had that here. And so once again, looking at the Klan here, as I did in chapter 5, raises a lot of questions. Well, the most important one to start with is why the Ku Klux Klan in Genesee County, of all places, in the early to mid-1920s in particular, when you have such a tiny African American population. I mean, who are they going to go after? Well, as I point out in the chapter, they weren't really all that interested in African Americans. They'd make passing references to it, in their literature and some of the speeches that took place in local churches that were supportive of the Klan at the time. But what they were really after were a whole host of other issues. They were after, once again, people they saw as foreigners, which still included, by the early 1920s, Irish Catholics in the county, Italian Catholics in the county. It included those who did not support, remember this is the time of Prohibition, so those who didn't support Prohibition, they were convinced that it was Italian and Irish Catholics who were largely the bootleggers supporting the effort against Prohibition, and as a result, they took it upon themselves to essentially deputize themselves and patrol the county roads openly as Klan members looking for bootleggers. They were also concerned with the small number of Jews who lived in Genesee County. They were convinced it's the Jews who were pioneering immorality. After all, they were involved in the film industry, and we all know that they were saying that was Jewish dominated. They make these immoral films. People actually kissed on film. And supporting that position, the first theater in Batavia in 1906 is owned in part by Jewish owners. So, Dreamland, I think it was called. So, the Klan is positioned against that. They're also positioned against what they saw as just too much freedom in post-World War I America, which included Genesee County. Young people going out on unchaperoned dates. Who knows where that could lead? They're going out in automobiles, and they're staying out at all hours of the night. And this is being endorsed by the culture at large. We must take a stand against this. This is not America. This is not traditional values. So the Klan, for a while, there was about, by 1924, it's estimated, there were about 3,500 open members of the Klan here in Genesee County. And what's interesting as well is that they were drawn from all sectors of society. You had professionals, you had teachers, you had attorneys, you had physicians, you had dentists, you had people who were manual laborers, those who had university educations, and those who hadn't completed grade school. There was something in it for everyone in the 1920s Klan, and that's what they based their appeal on. They also, ironically, despite everything I've said, they supported the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. It's a fascinating story. The one that, of course, gave women the right to vote in the first time in the 1920 presidential election. And why would they support, you wouldn't think, women's voting? They supported that because women who were what they called 100% Americans, those who were not foreigners, those who were not Catholics or Jews, those people were women also, and they could vote in the right way. And they could add to our support here for our program in the county. Yes.
Which day do you mean, the local KKK or the national KKK before the National Amendment?
The local KKK, and that's a good question. I don't know offhand if the national, I would suspect they did for the same reason. And then, of course, what's interesting, by 1925, the Klan begins to lose large numbers of members, not just nationally, but also locally. I talk a little bit about that locally, in part because people thought, wait a second, where's my money going? I sent in $10, I never got my robes. A district leader was accused by the membership of pocketing some of the money before it went to the national headquarters. So there was concern about where the money was being spent. And then finally, another reason you see the Klan, in my opinion, so much at that point is that this is a time in American life when you had all these benevolent organizations, the membership in the Elks, the membership in the Rotarians, the Kiwanis. It was all on a steep rise in the early to mid 1920s. In part because people used those, especially if they were in business, as a way to network. Remember, of course, this is long before the internet, and it's long before newspapers began with regular advertisements for jobs that were available. So the biggest, most common way that people found work was through word of mouth. So the Klan saw itself, it also fashioned its appeal as really just another benevolent organization. Join us and you'll make business contacts that may lead to a better job or a job that you're seeking first time around. One thing I stressed near the end of that chapter was I did not see any evidence in the county records that the Klan whipped anybody here in Genesee County or that they lynched anybody. I'm not saying that couldn't have happened, but there's no evidence of that. They burned crosses. That was a very familiar thing for them to do. That was clearly a signal to those not in the Klan, and that included, by the way, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who they had particular disdain for, because these were people who should by nature join us, and yet were taking positions opposed to us and were against us. So the crosses were also burned on the front lawns of people that the Klan felt should be in the Klan but had rejected them. So cross burning was common. There was a lot of that, places like Indian Falls, and I have some photographs of that. But outside of the cross burnings, I didn't see any evidence of any other violence. But of course, I think cross burning was a form of violence. It was obvious intimidation against people. And then finally, the last chapter that I have was a chapter on middle class women. And again, that grew out of the larger book. In the larger book, I had a whole section on women. I had one, the one you see in this book, on middle class women and their place in the county and their aspirations. And then I had another section on women, which will be in this second book, and that is poor women and enslaved women before the Civil War. But I'll leave that out for a moment. The women I have here, the middle class women, I tried to stress what they were involved in and where their activism was most notably seen. It was seen as early as the abolitionist movement here in the county. And that morphed over time into the suffragist movement, and then eventually the movement of women into positions of authority here in the county. And when we think of authority, I tried to stress in that chapter, it wasn't just political offices. Women who were school teachers, which in those cases gave them a certain amount of independence, even though the salaries were pretty minimal, and I didn't go into detail about a lot of that. They had these moral clauses in the contracts. If a woman married in the 19th century, in many cases in school districts, that was cause for their termination. You're not supposed to be married. You're supposed to basically be a mom, in effect, to the 40 students in your class. You shouldn't have outside interest in a family personal sense. But even despite those restrictions and the low salaries, etc., and the lack of something like job security, their contracts tended to be year to year. That offered for some middle class women a certain amount of independence, given the demands of the late 19th and early 20th century. You also had female clergy. I have a picture of nurses at St. Jerome's Hospital. I didn't talk about them, but by the 1920s, that also gave some women a sense that they could avoid the demands that society placed on them if they entered into the typical marriage arrangements, which then led, there was a little section I have, but this is where the legal history came in, the numbers of women who just avoided marriage at all in this period, in the late 19th, early 20th century. And for those who did get married, they would record their frustrations in diaries, and in some cases, that wasn't enough. And contrary to popular belief, some of them did go ahead and file for divorce. And that raises the whole issue of the complications that married women, especially married women who had access to property, found themselves in the late 19th and early 20th century. I have the Wordsworth case as an example of that near the end of chapter 6. I then concluded in the conclusion with just some final thoughts in which I talked about how there was just so much to write. And here I was at the end. I mean, the history press was, well, even SUNY before them, they were very, very clear about word limitation. They literally count every word. I could only go up to, I think it was 48,000 words for this, and that's it. So even the conclusion would have been longer if I had been allowed to put more in. That's why I started with the quote I have in there from a wonderful biography of St. Paul, in which the historian who wrote that said that, the longest histories ever written leave basically much more out than they put in, reminding the reader that this is hardly the last say by any stretch of the imagination on the history of the county. And even when that second book does come out, which I'm waiting to hear from them any week now, like I said, it's already written, that will hardly be the last word. It's going to be up to other people to pick up the torch and go on. But this is an incredibly rich culture and narrative here in the county that's still waiting in many ways to be written. Since I kept mentioning that second book to tell you just how long originally this was going to be, I just want to share with you real quick. That second book is tentatively titled, I'm not trying to sell you on this, I'm just trying to tell you how big this project was. So when I said 4 years, this is what I had in mind. This is basically half of that. It's hidden history of Genesee County. So I look at areas of county life really like this that haven't been written about much by either local historians or even national historians have looked at New York history. So I have in that second book basically a chapter on Emory Upton, but there's so much that's been written about him. I looked at it from the point of view of his connection with, again, wider trends in American life. What does the courtship between him and his wife mean within the context of love and romance in 19th century and early 20th century America, and also the impact he had on military thinking in this country to this day. Some of the handbooks that he wrote, some of the full volumes that he wrote, which influenced strategists and technicians long beyond the Civil War. And then a second chapter in which I look at the Civil War, but not in terms of battles. That's been done many, many times over. What was the idea of freedom here in the county? When people looked at their sons and husbands going off to fight in 1861, how did they conceptualize freedom? Was it simply restricted to the idea of liberating slaves in the South? Was it an idea of freedom that went beyond that? And I argue in that chapter it was far beyond simple emancipation of slaves. It led to things like they're thinking about the women's rights movement and a whole host of other issues. And then thirdly, I again shift focus in that book. The third chapter is simply a theme that has been developed here piecemeal by local historians, but no one's attempted to synthesize it. I simply call it Protestants in Genesee County. You can't begin to understand the general overall development of Genesee County's history unless you look at the role played by Protestantism and Protestant churches, and not just the mainstream Protestant churches. The various movements that came out of that, something like spiritualism or phrenology, right? The idea in the 19th century, you could feel the bumps on people's heads, and you could then conclude what their character is or isn't. Do they have criminal tendencies? All that stuff was part of 19th century Protestantism here in the county. And I talk about that in that chapter. And then the fourth chapter, which I thought had particular relevance to our own day, was, I simply call it Hidden Illnesses. I look at 5 U.S. presidents who we know now, looking back, were much sicker, physically sicker, than we were led to believe when they were president, and how those hidden illnesses were, well, kept from the public here in Genesee County. And I start with a president that's long overlooked, Chester Arthur. Most people, I'm not even sure who Chester Arthur was in 1881, but he was pretty ill, and that was kept from the public here, right up through Eisenhower, up through Ronald Reagan, Woodrow Wilson, and Calvin Coolidge was, I thought, the most interesting in that chapter. How completely depressed, I mean, he was clinically depressed after his son dies of septic poisoning, after he stubs his toe when he was 16 years old. He died when Coolidge was first in the White House. And Coolidge overnight goes from being a president who was very active, contrary to the image. There was nothing about him that was silent. A country lawyer from Vermont doesn't rise to go to the White House by staying quiet the first half of his career. His son dies, and he has this transformation overnight. And it's kept from the public just how bad it was. He was working about 3 to 4 hours a day, and that's not reported here in the press. He was sleeping upwards of 12 to 14 hours a day. He became a hypochondriac. All sorts of things were taking place. So I talk about that, and yet contrast that with the media representations here in the county. And I do that for the other presidents. Eisenhower was much more ill than we were led to believe here in the county and otherwise in the 1950s. Then I, again, radically shifted the focus, and this was really based upon another older interest I had, that article I wrote on food employment. We have this incredible collection of cookbooks in the county archives. And you start to look through those, and they tell you all kinds of things about what people thought about here in the county. So I entitled that, trying to remember. Yeah, American Culture and Cookbooks in Genesee County, 1830 to 1920. And so I jumped from the cookbooks put out by some Presbyterian woman's church group here in the county, and what does that say about what they were thinking about everything from presidential elections to how you're supposed to organize family life? There was much more in those cookbooks than you would imagine. I mean, it wasn't simply a collection of recipes. And then finally, the last chapter was, again, I mentioned before, on poor women. I start with enslaved women here in the county. There are some incredible records we have here. The numbers of owners of slaves in Batavia, for example, in the 1820s. And the numbers of, I focused just on their female slaves, some as young as children, 12, 13, 14 years old. And what do we know about their treatment? One slave owner who had come up from the South, and he brought 20 some odd, I'd have to go back and look at my notes, 20 some odd slaves from Virginia because he had heard there was this rich farmland up here in what was before the county came into existence, Genesee Country. And he thought, well, you know, I don't think there's as much future in tobacco. There's already oversupply. I'm going to go up there and grow crops. I'm going to take my slaves with me. And the horrendous stories that come out of that, the journal entries that we have. He's with his overseer and his family in a wagon, and these poor people are tied to the back of the wagon. They have to walk up from Virginia to get here. They were kept tied at night. They weren't given anything to eat, whatever they can find. They could just find some grass and boiled water. Some died along the way. So their traumas began even before they arrived. And some of the treatment of the slaves, as you can imagine. And again, we think of this as simply a Southern phenomenon, and I have found that when this comes up, when I talk to people here, well, I didn't know we had so many slaves and they were mistreated up here. We didn't have the number up here, to be certain. We didn't have the large cash crop production here, which meant large plantations in the South. But we had smaller farms, and those slaves weren't necessarily treated well, to say the least. Then you have, I have examples in that chapter, slaves who had escaped from the South and come up north and found themselves, say, in Batavia, and the authorities here are turning them over to the Southern bounty hunters. And people in Batavia, in this small village, are saying, no, you know, we know her, she's a good woman, she's screaming, crying, I don't want to go back to, I think in her case it was Louisiana, but off she goes. Shackled to the bounty hunters to go back to an obviously unknown fate. Then I talk about the poor women here and focus in particular on the women in the county home. Some of whom were, after slavery ended in New York State, were emancipated, but emancipated to what? They had no place to go. They had no skills. They were still facing enormous amounts of discrimination and exclusion. And they end up in the county poorhouse. And what do we know about their fates? And not just them. I stress in that chapter as well, all these poor white women. We tend to forget that. We tend to think in our own day, well, because of various current agendas, that most of the people who are poor are members of what we call racial minorities. Nothing could be further from the truth. You had all these poor white people, who in some cases were even poorer, who end up in the poorhouse for all kinds of reasons that I explore, given the evidence we have in that last chapter in that second book. So that gives you an overall picture of what I did in this book, and what I've done when the second book comes out as well. But again, it's hardly the last day. There's just so much here to talk about that I didn't in either book. I mean, there's just not enough time.